At 00:14 hours on September 26, 1983, a red light began flashing in the depths of the Soviet Union's most secretive military installation, Serpukhov 15. The alarm tone was cold, clinical, and irreversible. A single red icon appeared on the launch detection console, an intercontinental ballistic missile, launched from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, USA, arcing toward the Soviet Union. Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, sat frozen before the console. In theory, he had trained for this moment. In practice, no one had. 5 seconds later, a second missile icon appeared, then a third. The room didn't erupt into panic because everyone had gone completely silent. The kind of silence that only emerges when the world feels like it's ending. The Oko early warning satellite constellation had just issued its most dangerous alert missile launch detected. Confirmed. Protocols were clear. Petrov had 200 seconds to determine whether the warning was genuine or a malfunction. If it was genuine, Moscow would prepare immediate retaliatory launch orders. If it wasn't, he had to bet the future of the Soviet Union on a system he didn't fully trust. He leaned toward the screen. The data showed launch coordinates, trajectory arc, estimated time to impact. But something was wrong. No confirmation from ground-based radars, no heat plumes, no secondary launch activity, just space-based detection, just one input. And then came the question, delivered flatly by his superior through a crackling comm line, is this real? Behind that question hung a continent of warheads. If he said yes, a counterstrike could begin in under 10 minutes. If he said no and was wrong, millions of Soviet citizens would die without retaliation. But the logic didn't fit. Why would the USSR launch just a few missiles? Why not hundreds? Why now, why without warning? Petrov stared at the console. 3 blinking lights. 3 seconds ticking down. 3 decisions that could erase the world. And then, with nothing but intuition and the weight of human history pressing down on his shoulders, he said the words, "This is a false alarm." No proof, no override. Just one man refusing to follow what the machine told him. And he was right. Serpukhov 15 wasn't supposed to be vulnerable, built just outside Moscow, buried beneath reinforced concrete, and outfitted with the Soviet Union's most advanced surveillance equipment. The bunker was a monument to certainty, a fortress of logic designed to eliminate ambiguity in the nuclear chain of command. In theory, its systems would only speak when the world was on fire. And on that September night, they did. The Oko satellite constellation, the pride of Soviet orbital engineering, had detected what it interpreted as a U.S. missile launch. Specifically, it flagged a sudden burst of infrared light heat that matched the early stage of an intercontinental ballistic missile leaving a silo. It wasn't a guess. The system declared it with mathematical precision. The assumptions baked into that system were dangerously simple. Any sudden thermal bloom in the upper atmosphere from a known launch site was a missile. A single detection was enough to trigger an alert. The likelihood of a false positive was negligible. The designers had built Oko with absolute trust in physics. Infrared signatures were considered immune to deception, less prone to confusion than radar or telemetry. And critically, Oko didn't rely on one sensor. It used multiple geosynchronous satellites with overlapping fields of view. If one saw a flash, another confirmed it. That, in theory, eliminated doubt. But there was a flaw. The system had never been fully tested against certain environmental variables, especially not during autumn. when the sun's position at sunset could reflect off high-altitude clouds in the precise trajectory paths the system was calibrated to monitor. It was an edge case, a statistical ghost, and nobody had prepared for it. Inside the command post, that assumption hardened into operational procedure. If Oko says it's a launch, it's a launch. Human judgment was meant only to confirm, never to contradict. Petrov knew this. He also knew that just months earlier, a series of internal briefings had warned that ground radar detection systems still lacked integration with satellite alerts. In other words, if the satellites were wrong, the command had no backup verification. The irony. The system built to remove doubt had eliminated something else entirely: human skepticism. No simulations included false alarms. No protocol existed for challenging the computer's claim. And worst of all, officers like Petrov were trained to trust the machine more than their own instincts. The room he sat in had blinking consoles, maps glowing with flight arcs, emergency protocols stacked in folders labeled retaliation authorization. But none of those systems accounted for the most unpredictable variable of all, the sun. And as the Oko feed updated again, confirming the third launch, the weight of that oversight grew crushing. Soviet nuclear doctrine was engineered to respond not with rage, but with speed. From the moment an American missile left its silo, Soviet command calculated that they had roughly 20 to 25 minutes to confirm, respond, and launch a counterstrike. That window short, brutal, unyielding, defined everything about how their early warning systems operated. The chain was known as launch on warning. It meant that the USSR would not wait for warheads to land. If sensors detected a U.S., launch and confirmation followed. Retaliation would be immediate, total, automatic in everything but name. This doctrine placed immense power and impossible pressure on the officers monitoring the system. But it wasn't just technical. It was psychological. The structure assumed that the first launch would be real, that any hesitation was a weakness. And most of all, it assumed that the enemy would never bluff with a limited strike. The Americans, it argued, would go all in or not at all. That's why, when Oko reported not dozens, but just 3 launches, the logic collapsed. 3 missiles. There wasn't enough to decapitate Soviet command. It wasn't even enough to hit all primary strategic targets. It was too small to be a real strike unless it was the beginning of something worse. Within the walls of Serpukhov 15, this contradiction began to paralyze the room. According to doctrine, they should already be escalating call Kremlin command. Trigger missile force alert status. Prepare the nuclear briefcases. But that very doctrine had no clause for what if the data doesn't make sense. It wasn't built to question itself. To make matters worse, the system gave no explanation. The Oko console flashed red. Launch detected, estimated trajectory Moscow vicinity, impact in 18 minutes, no confidence level, no error margin, just cold certainty. But Petrov had read too many drills. He had watched too many war games end in annihilation because someone followed procedure too quickly. The irony was terrifying. The doctrine that was supposed to prevent nuclear surprise was now the biggest danger in the room. Because if the data was wrong and someone followed it, then a retaliatory strike would be launched in response to sunlight. Still, the system demanded obedience. The rules were carved into iron. If more than 1 missile is detected, assume a coordinated first strike. If no ground radar confirmation occurs within 120 seconds, escalate regardless. If satellite detection shows 3 or more launches, the window to decide shrinks. And with every passing second, that window closed tighter. Petrov didn't move. He wasn't supposed to be a decision maker, but in that moment, the system handed him one. Follow doctrine or break it. The second warning hit harder than the first, then a third, all within 40 seconds. 3 separate launch detections, all confirmed by the OCO satellite's onboard processing, each from a known U.S. ICBM silo field, each following a clean, arcing trajectory toward Soviet territory. The screens flashed START, the code for strategic nuclear launch detection. It was no longer a glitch. The system had escalated the alert status from anomaly to confirmed missile launch. Inside Serpukhov 15, the room locked into its rehearsed procedures. Phones came off hooks. Transmission lines went active. Emergency codes began routing toward the general staff in Moscow. This wasn't an exercise. If this was real, they were already behind. Petrov stood before the console, heart hammering. The data said one thing. His instinct said another. 3 missiles. Why only 3? If the United States wanted to cripple Soviet capability, they'd launch everything, 400, maybe 600 warheads. Not 3. And they wouldn't do it on a quiet night, without political buildup, without force mobilization. Nothing fit. The other officers in the room didn't question it. They didn't dare. Doctrine didn't allow for reflection. They were trained to execute. But Petrov wasn't just a technician. He was a systems analyst. And he noticed something no one else did. All 3 launches originated during the same orbital pass of the OCO satellite. They came from the same geographical sector, over the horizon. As the sun was setting in the U.S. heartland, a low-angle reflection, a known blind spot. The console didn't show clouds. It didn't show sunlight refraction. It showed heat signatures which could, under the wrong conditions, be spoofed by solar glare off high-altitude cirrus formations. This wasn't conjecture. He remembered a classified engineering report buried deep in OCO's design reviews that had flagged this very vulnerability. It was dismissed as improbable. Now, it was unfolding in real time, yet the timer kept ticking. With no ground radar confirmation, the system would escalate in just under 60 seconds. The call to the Kremlin was on hold. The chain of escalation hung on one phrase, confirmed launch detection. If Petrov uttered those words, Soviet missile forces would enter full launch posture. If he didn't, and the attack was real, he'd go down in history as the man who let his country burn. He stared at the screens. Then, in the most dangerous moment of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis, he made a decision no one else dared to make. He stood up, turned to the command channel, and said, "This is a false alarm. No launch confirmed." Silence followed. Not disbelief, not anger, just silence. And then the screens cleared. No additional launches, no impacts, no war. Just the eerie stillness of a system that had come seconds from ending the world because it mistook sunlight for missiles. The call reached Moscow at 17 hours. By the time Petrov reported his conclusion, false alarm, the Kremlin's highest military alert protocols had already begun to stir. Secure phones had rung in underground war rooms. The nuclear suitcase, the Cheget, had been activated for potential relay. Several members of the general staff had already been awakened, pulled from their quarters, or escorted to hardened bunkers under Moscow's surface. And now they were being told it wasn't real, that their billion-ruble orbital defense system, designed to detect a first strike with absolute precision, had simply made a mistake. The voice from Moscow was tight, clipped, and suspicious. Repeat, confirm status of missile launch. Petrov repeated his assessment. There is no launch, no ground radar confirmation, no secondary satellite confirmation. Infrared signals appear atmospheric. There was a pause. Then a second voice joined the call, colder, older, higher ranked. Comrade Petrov. Oko has never issued a confirmed alert before. You are aware of the responsibility you assume by denying this signal he was, and he said so, because what Moscow refused to accept was that their most advanced early warning satellite constellation, recently deployed, endlessly praised in state journals, the future of Soviet security could be fooled by the angle of the sun for years. Oko had been the answer to the American window of vulnerability. It had given the Soviet Union eyes in the sky, independent of radar. Now it was being second-guessed by a single lieutenant colonel who dared to use the one tool their doctrine had quietly abandoned judgment. But Moscow couldn't override him. Not yet. Protocol dictated that the initial threat report must be confirmed by ground radar or a second satellite track before launch commands moved to the strategic missile forces. That redundancy was designed to slow irrational escalation. Tonight, it saved the world. Still, Petrov could hear it in their voices' disbelief, but not relief. There was no congratulations, no recognition, no commendation, only suspicion that he'd failed to act. To admit that he was right would mean admitting the system had failed, and in the Soviet military-industrial state, systems were never allowed to fail. What they didn't know, what Petrov didn't yet know, was that minutes later, a declassified meteorological satellite would log the same data, a high-altitude reflection of sunlight off autumn clouds. Refracted at the exact angle the Oko satellite was most vulnerable to, he had been right. But in the Kremlin, the only question that mattered was what if he had been wrong. That question echoed in their silence, in the delay of follow-up messages, in the reluctance to clear the full alert. The system had triggered. The officer had disobeyed. The world had not ended, and Moscow had no doctrine for what came next. As the tension receded, it didn't vanish, it mutated. Inside Soviet intelligence circles, a new theory began to circulate. One that was, in some ways, even more dangerous than the false alarm itself. If it wasn't a real American missile launch, maybe it was a test. Not a technical glitch, not sunlight, but a deliberate American deception, designed to probe Soviet response times, disrupt the chain of command, or even push a nervous officer into overreaction. A strategic feint, cloaked as a malfunction. KGB analysts began drafting assessments suggesting that the United States might be experimenting with optical spoofing using satellites, weather manipulation, or classified aircraft to imitate launch signatures. It sounded absurd, but so did the alternative that a billion-dollar orbital system had been tricked by weather. The Soviet state had no appetite for random failure. The system couldn't be wrong, so the enemy must be behind it. That shift in assumption drove a wave of quiet investigations. Reports were ordered on the precise positioning of U.S. weather and communications satellites at the time. Speculative theories emerged about secret payloads launched by the space shuttle. A handful of generals even claimed the launches could have been part of a low-orbit psychological operation meant to sow panic. Petrov was not included in these discussions. He was pulled from duty for routine review, isolated, debriefed, and effectively sidelined. The man who had likely saved the world was being treated as if he'd nearly destroyed it. But in Moscow, the wrong theory had taken hold that the event was a Western trick. It wasn't just paranoia. Soviet military doctrine had long assumed the United States would exploit any technological vulnerability, and the Americans had their own classified systems capable of decoys, jamming, and spoofing. So why not this? The KGB began retroactive analysis of prior anomalies, looking for patterns they'd once dismissed. Even routine cosmic radiation bursts were re-examined through the new lens. Maybe the enemy was hiding behind the stars. This suspicion filtered into military exercises. In the months after the false alarm, new war games included scenarios in which early warning systems were compromised, not just broken. Officers were instructed to imagine enemy cyber intrusion decades before that term had entered the global lexicon. It was primitive, yes, but it revealed a shift. The Soviets no longer trusted the data, not because they questioned the technology, but because they believed the Americans had found a way to manipulate it. It was the wrong theory, but it felt safer than the truth. Because if the real culprit was sunlight and not the CIA, then the Soviet system had almost triggered Armageddon because it couldn't tell day from night. And that was unthinkable. While KGB analysts hunted shadows in orbit, a second, more insidious theory began gaining traction within the general staff. Perhaps this wasn't enemy action. Perhaps it wasn't a solar anomaly. Perhaps the entire OCO system had been compromised from within. The whispers started quietly. Questions about firmware, access protocols, software updates. Engineers were summoned for quiet interrogations. Code audits were launched under the guise of security verification. What they were really looking for was a saboteur. Because if no American missiles had been launched, and no CIA satellite was to blame, then someone must have deliberately altered the system. This theory painted an even darker picture. What if a mole embedded deep within Soviet Aerospace Command had tampered with the satellite's logic? Could a line of code reroute a data packet to simulate a launch? Could internal dissent create chaos from within? No one had evidence, but no one needed it. In the Soviet Union, paranoia was a political instinct, not a psychological flaw. One internal security memo speculated that the incident could have been a loyalty test, a scenario manufactured by anti-Soviet forces to see how far command could be pushed before retaliation. Another proposed a more terrifying version. Someone inside the system wanted war. The logic fed on itself. Trust in the OCO system collapsed not because of external failure, but because Soviet leadership refused to believe that their own perfect machine could have such a glaring blind spot. It was easier to suspect betrayal than imperfection. This triggered a wave of policy revisions. Background checks for OCO programmers were expanded. New dual authentication software. Verification protocols were drafted too late to matter, but just soon enough to look like action. Internal counterintelligence began profiling officers with unusual access to satellite telemetry streams. And the man who had refused the launch order, Stanislav Petrov, he was now an open question. Some suspected he had been planted to delay retaliation. Others believed he had overstepped his role and endangered the Union. His calm defiance became suspect. After all, who ignores 3 confirmed missile alerts without orders, Petrov never returned to a Space Command posting. The irony was staggering. The officer who had correctly interpreted the system's failure was now the one being scrutinized not for what he did wrong, but for what he did right. This second wrong theory sabotage became institutionalized. From then on, Soviet Strategic Command would operate under a grim paradox. They trusted their machines more than their men. And when the machines failed, they distrusted the men who noticed. In the darkness of Serpukhov 15, a red light had once flashed. Now it was a signal burned into the minds of an empire that could not decide what terrified it more, that the Americans had fooled them, or that they had fooled themselves. In the weeks following the incident, A closed-door inquiry convened inside a secure complex at Kaluga. It wasn't marked as a crisis review. It was labeled Performance Audit of Space-Based Warning Systems. But behind the euphemisms, the Soviet Union was dissecting its most dangerous intelligence failure since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The facts, once stripped of paranoia, were damning. The Oko satellite had not malfunctioned. It had done exactly what it was programmed to do: detect intense bursts of infrared radiation from the upper atmosphere. What it had not done was differentiate between a missile launch and sunlight bouncing off high-altitude cirrus clouds, refracted at just the right angle during a rare orbital alignment. 3 things had to go wrong for the alert to trigger. The satellite had to be positioned over the continental U.S. during late September sunset. Atmospheric conditions had to create a thin, reflective layer of clouds. The angle between the Earth, the Sun, and the satellite's optical sensor had to hit a precise arc. Those 3 variables aligned for just a few minutes each year, and no simulation had ever tested for it. Worse, the Oko software lacked a conditional filter to flag improbable events. It saw bright infrared signatures at high altitude, cross-referenced them with launch coordinates, and declared a missile event. No human override was built into the system, only an operator confirm input. Petrov had inserted himself into that role. The doctrine had not asked him to. If he had followed procedure and confirmed the launches, the next step would have been a scramble of Soviet forces and an alert to Missile Command that the U.S. had begun a nuclear strike, and there was no second verification, because ground radar never picked up a thing. Radar systems like Dnepr and Daryl, though powerful, had limited coverage of U.S. interiors and struggled with early arc detection. The time lag between satellite detection and radar confirmation could be fatal, and everyone knew it. That's why the Oko system had been entrusted with the first decision, and that's why it nearly destroyed the world. Intelligence analysts, reviewing the chain of events, couldn't believe what they saw: a system that was technically accurate, but operationally suicidal. A command structure that had delegated judgment to a satellite but required a human scapegoat when it went wrong. A process that gave officers no authority to reject alerts but all the blame if they didn't. The final classified conclusion of the audit was quietly circulated among top party officials under present conditions. Our strategic detection systems are incapable of reliably distinguishing false positive missile launches caused by atmospheric interference. It was the most expensive admission of failure the Soviet space program had ever written. No American agents had interfered. No sabotage occurred. The most advanced missile warning system on Earth had nearly triggered global nuclear war because no one asked how it would behave when the sky caught fire. While the Soviet Union wrestled with paranoia, panic, and procedural chaos, a very different reality was unfolding across the Atlantic. The American early warning system, by 1983, was not flawless, but it was resilient. Unlike the Soviet obsession with first strike detection at any cost, the U.S. had designed its system to absorb ambiguity, not escalate from it. The core of the U.S. Strategic Detection Network was a layered architecture. DSP Defense Support Program satellites, equipped with infrared sensors, operated in high Earth orbit, similar to Oko. But unlike the Soviet satellites, DSP satellites fed their data through redundant analytical chains, which required secondary confirmation and human review. Ground-based radar, like PAVE, PAWS, and BMEWs, was tightly integrated into NORAD's processing. These didn't just check satellite data; they often served as the primary confirmation tool. especially for low-yield or limited launch scenarios. And most importantly, the Americans had built a third pillar, the human decision layer. In the U.S., a detection didn't immediately trigger an alert cascade. It triggered a consultative process. Warning centers at NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, Strategic Air Command, and the Pentagon would enter real-time communication. Multiple commanders had to agree not just that an attack was underway, but that the response matched the threat. There was no equivalent to Serpukhov 15. No single officer was left holding the end-of-the-world lever, and doctrine reflected that reality. American nuclear posture in 1983 emphasized second strike credibility. That meant absorbing a hit, then retaliating, not in desperation, not in reflex, but as a calculated, survivable response. This created time, and time created safety. It also created something the Soviet system lacked: fail-safes. The U.S. had already experienced false alarms. In 1979, a training tape was mistakenly loaded into NORAD systems, simulating a full Soviet launch. In 1980, a faulty chip triggered a false warning of 2,000 incoming warheads. But in each case, checks and balances held. No alerts went to launch crews. No fingers hovered over launch keys. The system was flawed, yes, but designed to catch its own flaws before they cascaded. When Stanislav Petrov made his decision, he did so in isolation, without a backup plan, without cross-checks, without doctrinal protection. In the United States, that decision would have required 4 separate confirmations before reaching even the lowest level of presidential brief. And it wasn't just technical, it was cultural. American strategic thinking assumed the enemy might make mistakes, that weather could fool sensors, that systems could fail. Soviet thinking assumed errors would be punished. And so officers became scared to disobey data, even if that data pointed to the apocalypse. In 1983, Petrov saved the world with intuition. In America, that risk was mitigated with architecture. While the Soviet system spiraled from overconfidence, the American system endured because it accepted doubt as part of its core design. And in the Cold War, where every second mattered, that difference wasn't philosophical. It was survival. Inside Soviet military command, the aftermath of the false alarm ignited a silent war, not against the West, but within the Kremlin itself. The Ministry of Defense wanted to bury the incident. The KGB wanted to dissect it. The Space Forces, humiliated by their satellite system's vulnerability, rushed to commission redesigns, and the General Staff began rewriting doctrine that, just weeks earlier, was considered immutable. But no one wanted to admit what had truly happened. The officer who stopped World War III, Stanislav Petrov, was neither decorated nor publicly acknowledged. Instead, he was demoted, reassigned to a quieter post, and eventually retired. He received no commendation, no medal, no recognition, because to reward him would be to admit that the system had failed. Worse, it would mean admitting that the Soviet Union's crown jewel of early warning technology, OCO, had nearly destroyed the world-over cloud. This humiliation wasn't just bureaucratic, it was ideological. The USSR had built its image around technical superiority. OCO was marketed as the ultimate triumph of socialist engineering, a system immune to Western deception or technological error. Now, in secret memos and quietly retracted protocols, that fantasy was unraveling. The Americans had built redundancy into their warning chain. The Soviets had built certainty into theirs, and certainty doesn't tolerate doubt. It punishes it. Behind closed doors, the strategic rocket forces began introducing discretionary hold clauses into their engagement protocols buried in fine print. vague enough to preserve official doctrine, yet clear enough for insiders to understand, don't trust the machine. Training manuals were amended. Officers were reminded gently that not all alerts were real, and across war rooms from Murmansk to the Pacific, drills began to emphasize human interpretation over pure automation. It was the closest the USSR would ever come to admitting defeat without firing a shot. The humiliation extended beyond doctrine. OCO engineers were quietly rotated out. System logs were classified and sealed. Defense journals that once praised the satellites as infallible now published nothing at all. It was a blackout not to protect security, but to shield pride. Meanwhile, NATO learned of the event through signals, intelligence, and defectors. The Americans understood that something had gone wrong, but they never knew just how close they came to catastrophe. Petrov's name remained unknown in the West for nearly 2 decades. He vanished from history because in the Soviet Union, he had committed the most unthinkable act of all. He disobeyed certainty and was right. The battle wasn't fought with missiles. It was fought with silence, denial, and quiet edits to protocols that would never be explained. And in that silence, the true cost of Soviet humiliation echoed not in headlines, but in the terrified eyes of every officer who, from that night onward, understood the truth. The system would never protect them. Only their judgment could. The incident that nearly sparked nuclear annihilation was never publicly acknowledged, but its tremors fractured the very foundation of Soviet strategic thinking. At the heart of the Soviet military-industrial machine was a conviction that perfect systems, not people, would carry the burden of deterrence. Engineers would design, officers would execute, and machines would never lie. But after that September night in 1983, that belief quietly imploded. The system had done exactly what it was built to do, and in doing so, it had nearly destroyed civilization. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't American cunning. It was something worse, a failure in vision. The Soviets had built a technological empire on the fantasy of control. But in their pursuit of precision, they had eliminated the very thing that could stop catastrophe: flexibility. Petrov's decision forced a reckoning. Across the upper echelons of the Ministry of Defense, whispers of reform began to circulate. Some generals in private admitted that the U.S. doctrine of delayed retaliation, of survivability, had merit. They even began to model future systems with intentional ambiguity delays, redundancies, verification layers. But it was too late. The Soviet economy was fracturing. The arms race was bleeding resources, and trust in the supremacy of Soviet technology already battered by Chernobyl, by Afghan losses, by stagnant innovation, now faced its quietest but most lethal blow. The Petrov incident didn't just undermine a system. It humiliated a worldview. If the USSR's most advanced warning system couldn't distinguish sunlight from annihilation, what else had they misunderstood? By 1985, reformers like Gorbachev were using the whispers of system failure to justify deeper cuts, new treaties, openness. Glasnost was born not only from politics, but from the dawning realization that blind certainty was no longer a sustainable ideology. Internally, the command structure began to shift. Officers were given more discretion in strategic interpretation. Satellite design protocols changed to include failure modeling and edge case simulations, and most importantly, trust in the infallibility of the Soviet machine was gone, forever. The moment Petrov chose not to follow the red light, 1,000 dogmas died in silence. Soviet doctrine had long been about immediacy. The Americans threatened, the Soviets would respond. Now, delay became doctrine. Reflection became policy. The collapse of the Soviet military worldview didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a moment of hesitation, a pause that saved humanity, and revealed the hollow core of a system that had promised certainty and delivered chaos. In the shadows of bunkers, inside steel corridors lined with blinking consoles, the guardians of Soviet might came to understand something terrifying. The greatest threat to their survival had not come from NATO. It had come from their own belief that the sky could be trusted to tell the truth. For decades, the story remained buried. No one in the West knew the name Stanislav Petrov. No textbooks listed the false alarm. No monument marked the night when civilization hung on the intuition of a single man in a windowless Soviet bunker. It wasn't until 1998, 15 years later, that the truth began to leak. Through interviews, declassified records, and ex-officers unburdened by retirement. When Petrov's decision finally reached global ears, the world was stunned, not by what happened, but by how easily it could have gone the other way, and how close it had come. In 2004, Petrov received a United Nations award. In 2013, he was honored in New York. The world began to call him the man who saved the world, but he never saw himself that way. He once said in an interview, "I was just doing my job. I refused to be the final step in a mistake." That humility haunted every Cold War bunker, every missile silo, every satellite control room built on the illusion of certainty. Because the truth is simple. There was no system, no machine, no software. No radar net was immune to error. And the greatest threat to humanity wasn't a missile. It was the belief that mistakes couldn't happen. Today, satellite warning systems have evolved. Algorithms account for edge cases. Fail-safes are stronger. But the Petrov incident remains a permanent scar, taught in war colleges, modeled in nuclear response simulations, whispered in policy rooms. It's the ghost of a moment when time, fear, and physics almost fused into the end of everything. All because a satellite saw sunlight, and the system believed it. The Cold War ended, not with a warhead, but with a decision not to trust the glow in the sky. And for that, the world owes a debt it can never repay.